Okay, welcome to the last flipped classroom for Unit 3, Outcome 2. Today the focus of our presentation is looking at the principles for establishing healthy meal patterns. So as a little bit of a background context to this, we know that we're in an obesity epidemic. We know that in terms of our obesity and lifestyle related diseases, they're on the rise and they're having impacts in every sector in Australia. So economic, also medicinal, and our food systems as well. So what we're going to be looking at today is how can we start making some positive changes to reduce the incidence of these lifestyle related diseases? How can we nip it in the bud per se before it escalates into an established behaviour and a comfort eating habit, if you like? So what our focus is for today, bringing back to our key knowledge, we want to look at the role of modelling exposure and repetition as key behavioural principles for the establishment of healthy diets in children and also nutritious meal patterns in the home. Obviously, it's important that we focus on children because it is during childhood that we establish our healthy eating behaviours. Like we adopt a lot of mannerisms from our parents, we also adopt typically their tastes as well. But children aren't the only ones who, if you like, are getting fatter. So we also need to focus on looking at a way that we can plan meals that are suitable for the whole family so that everyone is getting that nutritious, wide variety of good, sustainable, fresh food at all times. The skill of how you're expected to apply this knowledge is to explain the principles behind establishing healthy meal patterns in families. So you actually need to understand how modelling exposure and repetition work. And like we know with all our other aspects of the study design this year, we do need to focus on being able to apply them as well. I will talk to you a little bit more about that when we get to looking at what you'll be doing for your assessment task in relation to this key knowledge and key skill. But it is important to start thinking about how we would do that now. So the first thing we need to consider is how do we actually learn the practice of eating? The reality is our eating patterns evolve during the first years of our life. And it is during those first years that everything is so crucial. The attachment with our parents, the bonds, the relationships, meeting those critical periods in terms of language and so on. So it's no surprise that what we generally learn in childhood sticks with us. So children learn what, when, and how much to eat through direct experiences with food. And this starts as early as when you have an infant, moving away from having a diet solely of breast milk to more the introduction of solid foods as well. What I'd like you to do is to now watch the video that I have emailed to you on YouTube, and that will provide a little bit of an introduction about the practice of eating itself. If we're to look at how we actually learn to eat, we obviously need to bear in mind that our parents influence children's eating behaviours in a variety of ways. When we are younger, we don't have the capacity to interpret food-related information. Particularly when we're younger, we can't prepare our own meals or make decisions about what we're going to eat. So when we are quite young, our parents actively make those food choices for us. They also serve as models for dietary choices and patterns. I mentioned earlier in the video that they do tend to influence our mannerisms and personalities. Well, that very much applies to what we eat as well. If you have a parent that is quite experimental with food and enjoys trying new things, then you'll find that their offspring will be exactly the same. We also need to look at the fact that we use feeding practices to reinforce the development of eating patterns and behaviours that they deem appropriate. So just like every parent has their own sort of way that they discipline their kids, in terms of how they choose to expose and get that wide range of eating patterns in their children, that's entirely up to them. So to sum it all up really nicely, essentially we learn and form our eating patterns and behaviours through others. And in particular, this happens through observation. I'm going to just pause with the PowerPoint for the moment and just relate to this slide. Now, although sustainable and nutritious meals is not something that is mentioned in the key knowledge and key skill that I mentioned to you earlier, it is part of the outcome statements for Outcome 2, Unit 3. I've put in bold those keywords sustainable and nutritious. The reason that they're in bold is because aside from the fact that we have a great food system, and at the moment we do have quite a good level of food security, that being that we have enough food to afford to feed everyone in Australia, okay? But we want to make sure that that is available for generations to come, so that my children, your children, grandchildren, and so on all have access to the high quality food supply and primary processing and production sector that we have now. And then obviously nutritious is bolded because that is a no-brainer. Our meals that we've been preparing over the course of this outcome have also had to be nutritious and offer a good impact on our health and overall well-being. So what we consider sustainable and nutritious meal patterns to actually look like or be is the ability to eat nutritious foods in the proportions according to the Australian Guide to Healthy Eating, and to maintain a healthy diet now and in the future without jeopardising the potential for future populations to meet their food needs. So again, we're seeing that AGHE pop up back again, and we know that is our food selection model that the government are really reinforcing and wanting everyone to follow, and follow that as a guide. We're going to encourage sustainable and nutritious meal patterns. We also need to look at the fact that we want to encourage the consumption of a wide range of foods. And basically this is the underlying message that you get from the AGHE and the ADGs. It's that concept of a balanced diet. So we've spoken about before in relation to restrictive diets and how they are quite negative for our health. And we looked at several examples on our Padlet wall. These food selection models want to encourage that holistic approach. And just like if we cut foods out of these models instead of trying to use them as a guide, if we're trying to introduce new foods to children but we're being too overbearing in terms of what we actually give them and what we don't, what actually happens is you can establish negative attitudes towards food in your children. And that can have implications not only for the current when you're trying to actually form their eating behaviours, but also later on as well. So before principles, we're also going to look at the barriers to establishing healthy meal patterns. So we know that it's not going to be necessarily a piece of cake to get kids to try every single thing that we come up with. The reality is when children actually refuse a nutritious food, such as a fruit or a vegetable, mealtimes can become stressful and confrontational. Caregivers who are trying to create those patterns, who are perhaps inexperienced or stressed, those emotions are going to radiate into the children, and therefore you really need to be in a positive mindset to sit down with the child and model those behaviours and not make it seem like a chore, because the child is going to pick up on those behavioural and emotional cues, and that is going to very much influence their willingness to try new things. The other difficult thing in terms of barrier is that we have a natural instinct to avoid putting things like chemicals and toxins that could potentially harm our bodies into our digestive tract. So when a child perceives something as being a foreign food, that natural instinct is going to come to the fold. We also need to consider the fact that parents and guardians may have poor eating habits themselves. We know that some of the social factors that can influence food choice are things like your education levels, your income, and your socio-economic status. If the parent themselves does not have a good understanding about what is considered a healthy, balanced diet, then how are they expected to pass that on to their children? So if that is the case, unfortunately, those children are already disadvantaged before they have even had a chance to actually have a good red go at it. So education levels definitely play a large role. These barriers can deny children of the nutrients that they require, and we know that childhood is a rapid period of growth and that they need lots of those nutrient-dense foods in order for them to reach their developmental peaks. But in addition to this, they are also deprived of healthy, responsive interactions with their caregiver. If the mood and the vibe is very unhealthy when you're trying to form these eating patterns, it's going to potentially damage the relationship with the caregiver as well. So just like an infant forms that attachment when they're first born to their primary caregiver, a process like this is absolutely no different. If we're looking at the fact that we want to establish healthy meal patterns, we need to consider, is there such a thing as being too controlling of a child's diet? Some parents are very precious towards their children, and they are rightly so. However, being overbearing can actually do more harm than good. So parents who are concerned about their child's diet may actually attempt to limit what and how much food is actually eaten. So they may pressure their child to eat a healthier diet, which then can form a negative association on the child's behalf. Again, if they're feeling pressure, if they're feeling stressed, and the process becomes something that is overbearing for them, they're not going to respond in a positive way to that. The other thing we see is that the parent may use the food as a reward. So they'll reward their child for eating healthy, but that doesn't necessarily make the association that we should be eating these healthy foods to promote good health and well-being. The child's just going to form that association that if I eat healthy, I get something that I like. So we need to be mindful about the way that we actually provide food in certain contexts. People who are highly restrictive also seem to not allow the child to learn for themselves. So if a child, when they're younger, where their parents largely control what they eat, when it comes to a time in adolescence where you move towards having more independence and you're making some more food choices on your own, you tend to have poorer self-regulations of energy intake as well. You don't necessarily understand the consequences so much because you're so used to being told what it is you should be eating. And this we associate with a greater weight gain across your childhood years as well. And again, pressuring is not healthy in any way, shape, or form. If we're to sum this up in terms of whether or not there is a definitive answer to say, is being too controlling a bad thing? The reality is it is. Excessive restriction of child's access to and intake of highly palatable foods can actually promote increased preference for, and therefore leading on to overconsumption of those discretionary foods when they're readily available. They're not going to have that self-control to just have one or two of those discretionary foods at various stages. It's going to be like, oh my God, I have access to chocolate, and they go crazy. So we need to be mindful very much so about finding that balance in terms of putting enough of a positive influence in place by setting them up and somewhat controlling so that they're eating healthy foods, but we shouldn't definitely be overbearing. We shouldn't be saying to kids, these are good foods, these are bad foods, these are fatty foods. We'll talk about all foods, but you need to discuss it in relation to how they're actually going to impact health. We're going to look at who's the primary influence for establishing healthy eating patterns. It's definitely our parents and our primary caregivers. So it's important for parents to be educated and knowledgeable for this exact reason. So if parents are looking at ways that they can actually improve food selection patterns in their children, what they can do is they can seek access from a number of places. There are maternal and child health nurses that you can go to and seek extra information from. Even doctors and GPs now will often have lots of pamphlets and information that you would be able to use right from when your child is actually born. So, example of a useful piece of advice could be that not adding salt to food when you're first introducing solids means that your child isn't going to become accustomed to high salt threshold. So that way, they're not going to know any different if there's no salt in that food. They haven't had previous exposure to it like we have. As a new parent as well, who's perhaps going through this process for the first time, you can look at creating a meal plan to help establish a routine and take away some of the stress about establishing these behaviours. So write yourself a list before you go to the supermarket. Be very mindful of selecting fruits and vegetables that are in a variety of colours. So again, we see that rainbow on our plate. And most of all, we want to teach our children how to enjoy all foods in moderation. And that word moderation really is the key to this whole process. If we're going to consider role modelling, we need to think that, again, that our children are like our mini-me's. Basically, they will mimic our behaviours. And so if you want to model healthy diets in the home, make your child as involved as possible in that process. Make them familiar from an early age and make them feel part of it. And again, that's all about creating that happy, positive environment. Lastly, the parent very much determines the consumption space. That environment that you're going to introduce children to new foods in needs to be an enjoyable one. You need to share time together, take away distractions like mobile phones, iPads, TV. Instead of watching TV as a family and eating their dinner, have a conversation about the food, the benefits for our health, and really start interacting about it. We can also teach our children how to enjoy food by making mealtime fun, getting them involved in the cooking, and we can even look at the variety. We can even model, to take it even further, drinking water at the table as well. So avoiding those soft drinks and juices, which are sometimes really high in sugar as well. Nitty-gritty, really, we see that we have 3 basic principles to establishing healthy meal patterns in children and families. They all very much relate to one another, and therefore the best way to represent these is in a Venn diagram. Our first principle is modelling. Now, modelling refers to demonstrating healthy ways of eating to someone watching, including through observation and imitation. We know that families are predominantly the role models, however, they're not exclusively the only models. Particularly as we progress through the lifespan, what we see is that when you go to your childcare centre, the teacher and the other children start to have an impact, and even more so at school. It's really important that through modelling, we lead by example. So positive role modelling will look like you're interested in food, you're not fussy to try new things, and you're quite adventurous. If you as a parent or caregiver display these behaviours, your child is going to be more likely to as well. However, if we are being poor role models, that is, we're creating negative perceptions about food, we're restricting our own diets and cutting certain food groups out when we should really be eating a balanced diet, the child is very much going to adopt these behaviours as well. If they see that you're restrictive and unwilling to experience new things, they're going to be unwilling to try that food for themselves as well. So there's very for positive role modelling to take place. Obviously, meal times at home is going to be the largest, most predominant area that's going to facilitate the development of those eating patterns. But regardless of whether that's an every night occasion, which we know often isn't the case when our children get older, we still want to make those meal experiences positive and enjoyable. You want to avoid bribing, as we said, because this child is then just going to associate that they get something that they want out of it, as opposed to actually understanding and becoming knowledgeable about what they're eating and how it's going to affect their body. It's also a really good idea to initiate conversations about hunger and satiety, and this is going to enable recognition of these sensations. By talking about what hunger is, so that slight pang in your stomach when the previous meal has been digested, or satiety, which is that state or feeling of fullness, we are able to educate our children to know that, are you actually hungry? Or are you eating because you're bored? Or you're seeing something that you want? We also need to talk about satiety because children, eyes bigger than their belly, typically speaking, will just eat and eat and eat until they make themselves sick. Classic, child's party that you go to when there's tons of lollies and party pies and sausage rolls and chips and all those goodies. So by actually having that conversation with your child, and if they do come to you and ask for more food after they've just been fed, you can start to have those positive conversations about, are you really hungry? Why don't we wait a little bit and then see if you're still hungry, then I'll give you some food. The child may actually then become distracted, and then you'll be able to determine that they're not actually really hungry. So conversations definitely need to be positive, and they can happen at meal times as well. We also need to teach our children about foods in terms of understanding what to look for when we're shopping. So we involve children in the planning of the meals, take them to the supermarket with us, have that positive conversation regarding how do we decipher the information on a label. And obviously you're going to have to selective about what age group that you're going to do this with. But starting it earlier is going to make a world of difference. You can even involve your child in the cooking of dinner. Model healthy meal preparation. Get the child to help pack their lunchbox. What do we want in our lunchbox today? What piece of fruit should we have? If they are more involved, they're going to be more willing to adapt to these behaviours. And cooking really is a fundamental life skill. If a child can develop these skills now, later on in life when they do have to fend for themselves, they're going to be able to prepare themselves healthy meals as opposed to relying on takeaway and other sources of food that could potentially affect their health. Our second principle is exposure. So exposure refers to continually introducing foods and experiences around food and ensuring that we have regular contact with food. And regular contact is a key thing here. So we need to make sure that we are not only exposing our children to a wide variety of foods, but we're doing it frequently enough. So many children are very fussy eaters, and we've spoken about this as a natural instinct. They're very reluctant to try most new foods. However, as the holistic approach of our AGHE reinforces, we need to be encouraging a wide variety of foods. Positive exposure to a range of foods will help to develop a broad taste and dietary variety. So again, get them to try lots of things, and don't have that expectation that unrealistically they're going to like everything the first time they eat it. That's 100% not the case. It can actually take 10 times and beyond in terms of a child trying a food for the first time to actually make a decision about whether they like it or not. So multiple exposure is definitely the key in developing a broad sense of taste, and to actually appreciate that we want to be eating a wide range of different foods. So exposure to our child, we want to offer a wide variety of foods. We want to have plenty in the home, so if they are inquisitive and start to, look in the cupboard or look in the fridge, again, you can facilitate those conversations. They can explore for themselves and have that curiosity, which is really a positive thing to have. Include a range of colours, have that visual appeal on a plate. Rainbow colours are probably very much going to appeal to a child, as well as having different textures and flavours, so they're not just doing the same thing all the time. Keep it interesting. And at the very least, encourage and positively reinforce the child to try the food, even if it is only a small bite. It's not going to be constructive in any way having a go at a child for not finishing an entire new food. Celebrate the fact that they have got over their anxiety in relation to this new food and got over the reluctance, and the fact that they've actually had a go. Opportunities for increased exposure occur in a variety of formats. We've spoken about the importance of the home, but we also see childcare and early learning centres as well. So what we often see at kindergarten and creche and things like that is they have meal times very much like you would at home. So everyone's sitting around that communal table, which we know is going to build the connectiveness and really that social aspect to food. So it's going to also help if the children can be involved in the preparation of healthy lunches and snacks. And this is probably more so possible when they're at kinder ages as opposed to toddler, but they could definitely still help in terms of setting up a fruit platter or some other sort of healthy snack. When we get older, obviously we have school, and that's when you start to see the comparison of lunch boxes. What do you have in yours compared to what I've got some in mine? Providing that other parents are applying these principles too, this can also be really positive, because if a child perhaps has a new fruit or muesli bar that the child hasn't had before, we may then see that child want that food and expand their own diet. We also see programs like Kitchen Garden Program. So the Stephanie Alexander Kitchen Garden Program is a really great initiative encouraging sustainable and nutritious meal skills in children. And this very much relates to things like your home economic classes that you do as well. So building those fundamental food skills so that we can become informed consumers and be able to provide for ourselves in a healthy and nutritious way. Final behavioural principle for establishing healthy meal patterns is repetition. So this refers to establishing patterns of eating that continually offer and expose individuals to healthy and nutritious meals. Again, repeatedly, continually, over and over again. So food refusal is common, and there's actually a proper term for that, which is neophobia. It is important to encourage the child to be adventurous, and as I said before, it can take 10, 15 times before you get that level of acceptance of a food. It is good to incorporate the unfamiliar food in a variety of contexts. For example, my brother loves potato chips. Always had. Whether they're oven baked or actual crisps, potato is his thing. However, to this day, and he's 19 now, he still will not eat mashed potato. He will not eat boiled potatoes. He will only eat it in the form of the chip. So if you can vary the way that you actually plate up and incorporate that different food, it may work to your advantage, because they may prefer it in one context to another. It might just be the texture that is putting the child off. It also makes it more fun, focusing on a vegetable and seeing how many different ways you can incorporate it in a particular week. Hidden vegetables, if your child is really reluctant, may also be a really good strategy. Hiding it in things like your spaghetti bolognese, or when we did your spicy meat and vegetable pockets, you grate it away in there and it really becomes barely visible. So, a repertoire of healthy household meals. This also comes as a key skill, and we did address this when you were asked to prepare a healthy family meal. So there's a couple of tips to help parents and caregivers, or even yourselves, to develop those healthy household meals. Firstly, what we can do is we can connect on social media. We can use that power and the technology that we have so readily available us to our advantage. Look at blogs, we can look at the Eat for Health initiatives and other government initiatives, and we're able to share information and get ideas about how do we have healthy eating habits in the home. By setting yourself a budget, it does make it easier as well. Particularly your organic foods are going to be a little bit more expensive. So have a budget, stick to it, and plan your meals. But where possible, it's always really important to remember that we want to get unpackaged whole foods. Therefore, we're also minimizing the effect on the environment, but by also purchasing foods that are in season, they're going to be more within your budget, they're going to be cheaper, and they're generally going to be better in nutritional value as well. Now, fresh is really best. However, there are some other equivalents like frozen as well. So we want to incorporate fresh produce into our diet because we're able to have it at its peak and familiarize our children with that as well. But you can also have stocked up cans of beans, chickpeas, tomatoes, and other vegetables in your pantry or your freezer. And the advantage is that we know we're time poor. And so if you feel like coming home one night and you're really not up for making a meal, you can make something super simple with a can of types of tomatoes, chuck some chickpeas through it and some veggies and cook it in the one pot. And you still have a relatively healthy meal with minimal effort. It's also important that you read labels. We know that some labeling information can be deceiving, but if you have somewhat of an idea about what different ingredients are or some claims and health benefits from eating and interpreting the ingredients in that, then we are able to make more informed decisions and therefore know what actually is healthy for us. And finally, don't forget your food selection model. So we've got our ADGs and our AGHE. So it's very important to remember all these little tips. They all add up, and hopefully you can now understand and are confident to apply our behavioural principles. To finish this PowerPoint today, I would like you to answering this question. So this question is actually off the sample exam that VCAR have just released this year. So you can see that what's in front of you is a 5-day evening meal plan for a family. What you need to do is you need to identify 2 key behavioural principles and see where they are applied in the meal plan. And then you need to explain how each of these principles contributes to the establishment of a nutritious meal pattern. Remember, when we are given stimuli, it is important that we refer to it. So please do pay attention to some of the meals and use examples to support your response. And also use the fact that it is a 4-mark total. We will be going through this question in class. So at the very least, have a go, even if you're not quite sure.